Good morning, everybody, and thank you for that introduction. As Knapp said, I'm Bonnie, and I'm a journalist and the author of Untrustworthy, which you will see in every slide, so you can't forget it, and it comes out on October 11th. And so almost everything that I will say here today draws on my research and conclusions in Untrustworthy, so if you think it's helpful, do please order copies and tell my editor I said this. And if anything, I think the book will be better. You know that part in, I think it's 2 Corinthians, where Paul says, people always say his writing is really powerful, but in person, he's unimpressive. Much like the Apostle Paul, I think I'm better on paper. So my topic for today, and David, I didn't know what he was going to talk about, but it teed us up really nicely. It's about how identity and community contribute to our knowledge crisis, but also how they can help us seek truth. And by knowledge crisis, I just mean this confusion that is so prevalent in our society, this confusion around what is knowable, what is true, who is trustworthy. And it's confusion that's really exacerbated by how we're overwhelmed with so much information all of the time. And so identity and community can contribute to this knowledge crisis, but they can also help us seek truth. And I want to start by just briefly explaining why I landed on this topic as my focus, because it was not my first inclination at all. And that may seem strange after having just heard David talk about identity politics, but let me explain my thinking for a second. I was on the fence about what I should discuss that would complement the other speakers. I was the Johnny-come-lately to this event. And I was thinking a lot about you all as an audience and what would be most useful to you in what I'm guessing are probably politically conservative contexts. And in the book, I have these 6 topical chapters, and 3 are about problems I see as more prevalent on the right in America today, and 3 are problems I see more common on the left. And so as I was thinking, what should I say in Texas, I was looking at those rightward chapters and not really considering the other ones at all. But then I was talking to Austin Gravely here at Redeemer, and he suggested one of the chapters that I thought of as left-facing. And I was initially sort of taken aback. It was the chapter about identity and lived experience, which is a phrase that you may have heard if, like me, you are online too much. And that sort of threw me because the people you hear talking about lived experience and all the finer details of their identity, race, sexuality, gender, disability, class, and so on, these are not generally the sort of the stereotypical evangelical churchgoer in West Texas. And so I was mulling over what Austin said, and then I ran across this tweet, courtesy of Knapp, actually. I think you can see his little retweet indicator at the very top there. It's from a writer named Will Salatin, who is sort of the resident liberal at The Bulwark, which I describe as a never Trump center-right site that is frequently mentioned in the same breath as The Dispatch. So apologies to David for giving his competitors some free advertising. But anyway, Salatin is sharing this post from an anonymous Twitter user who has 25,000 followers and goes by Saving America. And I just want to pause real quick to show you Saving America's Twitter profile picture, which says Saving America 1 tweet at a time. If you ever find yourself believing tweets can save the country, just please log off the internet and never go back. All right, but I digress. So Saving America has taken a screenshot of one of Salatin's earlier posts, and he's marked the fact in red there that CNN host Jake Tapper has retweeted it. And Saving America comments, "You lost me on CNN, and then you really lost me when I saw Jake Tapper retweeted it." And to this, Salatin responds, this kind of thinking, refusing to even consider information or arguments because you don't like the perceived politics of the person who brought the information or arguments to your attention. This is a major reason why much of our population has lost touch with reality. And this reminded me of Austin's suggestion to focus on identity. And it sort of made things click for me in terms of how this plays out among conservatives in contrast to how it looks among progressives. And with progressives, I think it's more explicit and obvious, and we're going to talk briefly about that first. But on the right, it's sort of a hidden danger. And so what I want to delve into today are 4 things. What is identitarian deference? What does it look like in conservatives? How identity and community can be a source of confusion instead of clarity, and how identity and community can help us to seek truth. All right, so we're going to start with what is identitarian deference, or you could call it ID. This is a little wonky, but bear with me. So this is a term that comes from a guy named Matt Bruenig, and he himself is on the left. He would describe himself as a socialist, and that's not a slam on him, as the word is often used. That is just literally his politics. He's a socialist. And that's relevant because it makes him really focused on economics and class, and therefore not on the identity stuff that so many of his fellow people on the left have become obsessed with. And that gave him a unique perspective to start criticizing that obsession before this identitarian deference became really mainstream, before people outside the left noticed that it was going on. So before this was even on the radar for a lot of the country, and I would include myself in this, a decade ago, Bruenig coined this term identitarian deference. And the idea is that you defer to people, to their arguments, their truth claims, their policy positions, based on their identity. Specifically, the more oppressed someone is, the more you have to listen to them, especially on matters relating to their oppression. So it's the idea, he says, that privileged individuals, people who aren't oppressed, should defer to the opinions and views of oppressed individuals, especially on topics relevant to those individuals' oppression. The identity, or again, sometimes you'll hear the lived experience of the speaker, whoever's making the argument, is what matters most, much more than the persuasiveness of the argument they're making or the quality of the information they're presenting. And this assumption of deference is why there's this increasingly common verbal tic that you'll see, especially in more progressive spaces, where people will say, speaking as an ex, speaking as an immigrant, speaking as a lesbian, and so on. And I'm very old, so I can't speak from personal experience here, but it wasn't like this when I went to college. But a Columbia University political science professor named Mark Lula says this is super common in college classrooms now. Using this phrasing, he says, tells the listener that I am speaking from a privileged position on this matter. One never says, speaking as a gay Asian, I feel incompetent to judge the matter. It sets up a wall against questions, which by definition come from a non-ex perspective, and it turns the encounter into a power relation. The winner of the argument will be whoever has invoked the morally superior identity, not the person who makes the better, more truthful, more informed, more persuasive case for their perspective. Now, Bruenig makes a great argument against identitarian deference, which I explain in my book, and I say some very smart things about it too, and we're going to skip all that stuff because, number one, that's why you should fill out that survey and get my book, and number two, I'm guessing that you guys already think that identitarian deference and speaking as an ex is a bad way to do political conversations. I don't think I probably have to sell you on the idea that these discussions shouldn't simply be a power play. But what I want to suggest is that conservatives do a version of this too. The right has largely bought into this model of politics, even while vehemently denouncing it. Now, on the right, it's not usually about race or sexuality or rankings of privilege and oppression, though sometimes you do see a variant of that, where there are these pundits who trade on the basis of being, say, black or gay and also a conservative, right? Like a few years ago, there was this British guy named Milo Yiannopoulos, and his whole thing was being a gay conservative. And the reason he got a big following was that he would offer a right-wing perspective on LGBTQ issues while being gay himself. And so his followers essentially love to be able to say, well, we're just practicing identitarian deference by deferring to his perspective as a member of this community. And of course, his perspective just so happened to be identical to their own. It's a very cynical move, but it's also exactly what the rules of identitarian deference encourage. But more often on the right, identitarian deference is not about the individual. It's much more about identity and connection to community. Are you one of us? Are you part of the in-group? Are you a Republican, a Christian, a conservative, a Trump fan, a real American, a deplorable, a patriot? And if you are, you're worth hearing. And if you're not, you're not. And so it's the sentiment in that tweet, you lost me at on CNN, then you really lost me when I saw Jake Tapper retweeted it. Everything is about who is on our side, who is helping us get power and who is taking it away, who is in our community and who is out. And therefore, who will we listen to and who is our enemy, which is to say, who is always to be mocked or ignored and certainly discounted whenever it's convenient. And I want to pause here and distinguish between losing patience with specific people or media outlets who have repeatedly been dishonest and foolish in demonstrable and controvertible ways. That's very different from writing off whole swaths of the country based on community boundaries alone. And those boundaries really kick in when we're talking about the media writ large, right? Because journalists do tend to be further left than the most of the country. And that's not just opinion writers and pundits, it's also reporters on the ground, like the people who we rely on for very basic fact-finding stuff. And those reporters perform an incredibly important function in our society and our politics, and so writing them all off, people like Reuters, the Associated Press, the folks who go out into war zones and go to diplomatic talks and just do that basic fact-finding. Writing all of those people off on the basis of their identity makes it very, very difficult to keep a good grasp on public reality in our country and in the whole world. And while I have many, many critiques of CNN, and indeed, I would say the entire concept of putting news on television, and would certainly grant that reasonable people will sometimes disagree in good faith about who has crossed that line into confirmed dishonesty and foolishness. And by foolishness, I mean like as in Proverbs, right? Like someone who is hot-headed, unwilling to heed instruction and advice, always convinced of his own rightness. For all that, I would say that generally, the right-wing identitarian deference or tribal behavior that I'm describing here is not going to be about like, here are 10 specific cases where Jake Tapper reported a wrong thing and refused to issue a retraction. It's not going to be that specific and reasoned. It's because it's not about actual errors and bad journalism from CNN, though there may be that. It's about CNN being the outgroup, having the wrong identity, not being part of the right community. This is how identity and community can be a source of confusion instead of clarity. As Christians, I think we're incredibly primed to only have positive associations with community and to think of thick community life as a cure for many, many ills. And often it is, and this is, I think, something that Jeff Bilbrough, who's speaking after me, is going to talk about in a little bit here. But one of the things I realized while working on my book is that community is necessary for grasping truth in this confusing time, but I don't think it's enough. It's not sufficient. So I tell a story in the book about the church, my church when I lived in Minnesota. I lived there until last summer. We undertook a congregation-wide discernment process. It's a pretty small congregation of about 50 adults, so we could do that. It was about gay marriage and ordination because our denomination wanted to vote on it, and so we were trying to, do our due diligence and send our representative to the conference. And what we quickly found out was not only did we not agree on these issues, as many of us had unwisely assumed about each other, but we didn't agree on how to answer the questions. We had very different ideas about how to decide what was true on these subjects, and those differences even cut across lines of the main issue, the actual question of gay marriage. So not only we couldn't agree, we couldn't, as a community, agree on how we would agree. And our problem, it wasn't lack of community. We had a really strong community life. Almost everyone deliberately lived within 3 miles of each other, which is less impressive in the Twin Cities than it would be here. But, we were hanging out multiple times a week. We were shoveling each other's sidewalks, watching each other's kids, sharing tools, the whole deal. But having that strong sense of community was not alone enough to help us discern the truth together. And worse than that, though, I think, is how loneliness and our desire for a strong community can actually make us susceptible to lies. So there's a philosopher named Hannah Arendt, and she wrote in the aftermath of World War II. She was a German Jew and a Holocaust survivor who was able to flee to the United States. And her most famous book is about totalitarianism and how it happens. One of the things she says is that lonely people are more likely to believe lies. When we're lonely, she says, when we're not in community, we start to lose touch with reality. It makes us vulnerable to confusion because we don't have, in her phrase, trustworthy company to talk to have them check our assumptions and tell us if we're making sense. I mean, there's a reason that when we think about someone stranded on a desert island, we think about them losing their mind, right? Like something like 1 in 5 young adults in America say they have no friends. And how can you stay in touch with reality when you don't have friends? We need trustworthy company to keep a grasp on the world around us. We can't do it by ourselves. And beyond that, when we're lonely and we don't want to be, when we want to be in community, that makes us susceptible to confusion and deception, if that's what we're getting from the only community on offer. This is something that's crucial to understand about the way that conspiracist thinking works today. And by conspiracist thinking, I don't mean a particular conspiracy theory. I mean an accusatory, credulous, often fearful mindset that treats rumor as research and innuendo as proof. An accusatory, credulous, often fearful mindset that treats rumor as research and innuendo as proof, especially if that innuendo or rumor is coming from people with the right identity, people in the right community. We think about conspiracy theorists as one guy down in his basement, right? Like, he's got wild hair, he's gross, he could use a shower, he has the wall of all the documents, and there's red string connecting them all. This is the image that you see a lot on social media to represent conspiracy theorists. But I would suggest to you that this is not how conspiracism works anymore. I would suggest that it looks like this. Why is she so happy? She's happy because she's talking with her friends, with like-minded people who are excited and worried about and anticipating all the same things that she is. She's spending time with her community. She's deferring to people whose identities she values, and they are listening to and deferring to her in turn. It feels great. She's having a great time. Now, there are a lot of reasons why people get into conspiracism, and some of them are more sympathetic than others, including, that conspiracies do happen sometimes. I couldn't believe it when I found out that MKUltra was a real thing and not something people made up. It was very real. They were just giving people LSD out in the wild. But a really big reason that conspiracism is attractive to people is that it happens in movements now. It invites you into community. It gives you a valuable identity. It makes you worthy of deference. You can make really good friends by getting into QAnon. And people deeply need really good friends. Like, you're gonna have a hopping group chat. It's gonna be so much fun. People like that. And so C.S. Lewis has this idea called the inner ring, which he describes as the sacred little attic or studio, the heads bent together, the fog of tobacco smoke, the delicious knowledge that we 4 or 5, all huddled beside the stove, are the people who know. Conspiracist communities are just the digital update to the inner ring. And that feeling of confusion, of being in the in-group, of having an identity that makes you worth listening to, that's very, very powerful. People will swallow a lot of nonsense to feel like that, to feel like they deserve less deference, to feel less lonely. So identity and community can be a source of confusion because community is necessary but not sufficient for seeking truth. We need trustworthy company to stay in touch with reality. But ironically, being desperate for community can make us vulnerable to lies. And one more thing is that your community doesn't have a monopoly on truth. The people on the right side with the right identity, and yes, even when the identity we're talking about is Christians, we don't have a monopoly on truth. We, as it turns out, unfortunately, we're all sinners. We all lie. We all have blind spots. We all have a limited perspective, which is very, very far from the God's eye view on things. There's a prayer from the medieval theologian Thomas Aquinas, which I like to pray a lot. And it begins like this. Creator of all things, true source of light and wisdom, lofty origin of all being, graciously let a ray of your brilliance penetrate into the darkness of my understanding, and take from me the double darkness in which I have been born, an obscurity of both sin and ignorance. We all have that double darkness of sin and ignorance. And that applies to every in-group, every identity, every community, including the political right and including the church. And so practicing identitarian deference to ignore voices outside of our in-group and relying on the fact that we are in community alone to steer us right, that will not stave off confusion and deception in an information environment as chaotic as ours. Let me say that again. Rejecting or discounting voices outside our in-group and relying on the simple fact that we're in community, as good as community is, that alone will not stave off confusion and deception for us. It will add to our knowledge crisis rather than alleviate it. So how can identity and community help us seek truth? I want to suggest a few things. First is, I'm going to really punt and say stick around and listen to Jeff. But second, to say that we should not decide who's worth hearing or who wins the argument on the basis of their identity, whether that's race or political beliefs or whatever. To say that is not to say that identity doesn't matter. Who we are, what we've experienced, what we believe, all of that obviously does matter. It matters a lot. It has an enormous impact on our perspective, on what we notice, what we choose, and what we think other people should choose. And so there's a big difference between speaking as an X to shut down a conversation and saying it to raise a question or offer a different insight or even admit our own ignorance or uncertainty and ask for help or for more information. And we know this, right? Like, this is why we read scripture together in Bible studies. We learn from each other's insights, from insights we wouldn't have on our own. Just as different giftings of the Holy Spirit work together to build up the church, so our different identities and experiences in the body of Christ work together to discover knowledge and reveal truth in Scripture and in the world at large. It's the classic passage on this. The eye cannot say to the hand, I don't need you. And the head cannot say to the feet, I don't need you. We need people with different perspectives, not only to answer questions we can't, but to ask questions we would never think to raise. Recognizing the value in a variety of perspectives isn't giving in to moral relevance or identitarian deference. It's an honest acknowledgement that none of us has that God's eye view. When I was growing up, my mom would say, God is not a God of confusion, which I think is a paraphrase of the KJV translation of 1 Corinthians 14:33, which says, for God is not the author of confusion, but peace. Now that passage is about orderliness in worship, and so I don't know that her application of it to like cleaning my room was super fair. But I do think that it's true that God does not want us to be confused or unable to comprehend and communicate truth to one another. God didn't call us to knowledge of reality in an unintelligible world or command us to unity of Christ across impassable boundaries of reality. He doesn't give us these commands that are impossible for us to do. In fact, I think part of the ministry of reconciliation that Paul talks about in 2 Corinthians 5 includes the reconciliation of being able to speak with each other, being able to learn from one another, being able to listen to the outgroup, maybe even if, God forbid, they have gone on CNN. And full disclosure, in July, I did go on CNN. It was 5 a.m. and it was terrible. But lastly, in community, we can risk developing a tribal pride, but community, as David was saying, is also a crucial asset in developing a common sense humility, which is essential in seeking truth in an untrustworthy time. And by a common sense humility, I just mean recognizing the fallibility of human and sinfulness of human thought and conversation, and especially recognizing it in ourselves. We are not creatures of pure reason. Like, this is the rider and the elephant, right? We mistake opinions for knowledge. We think that anecdotes are data. We are unwittingly ignorant and unjustifiably confident. Or sometimes we go in the other direction and we just despair of knowing truth and occupy ourselves with trolling and tribalism and empty entertainment. Rather than cultivating humility, we tend to either ascend to arrogance or just fall into a discouraged apathy. And so right now, we know in part, and often a smaller part than we would like to think. But we can know some things. And if we're going to delve into news and politics, and for the record, I think most of us should do a lot less of that. And if I had to give a single line of advice here today, it would be log off, consume dramatically less news, even my stuff, and just give politics less space in your brain, because there's a 99% chance you will never fix any of it, and our political system is representational. So the whole point is that the vast majority of people delegate their political responsibilities and get on with better things in their own life that have nothing to do with politics. But if we're going to delve into news and politics, we have a responsibility to discern the truth in what we encounter there. And so here are a few distinctions that I find helpful in trying to pursue truth humbly. One is that objective truth exists, but humans are not objective. And that does include the media. It includes me, it includes you. And that's why, as an aside, I would suggest to you that objectivity from the media isn't really possible, and is also much less important than journalists simply being honest and as factual as we can, while also being open about our own views, so that our audience can figure out where we're most likely to get things wrong. Number two, truth is knowable, but that doesn't mean you know it. And that's a plural you. Our communities as well, whether that's locally or at church, or especially in our political tribes. And third, your perspective colors your understanding, but you can still understand. Just throwing up our hands and saying, well, everyone's biased, so I'm going to go with my facts or the facts that my in-group likes. This is not where Christians can land on this stuff. Now, all these run along the same theme, right? Which is that truth exists for us to seek it. God created us to be knowers of truth, but we are very flawed truth seekers. We have that double darkness, that obscurity of both sin and ignorance. But since we don't all have the same sin and the same ignorance, that's where community and people from outside our communities can help us as we strive to humbly pursue and speak truth in love. It's the same, it's a lot like even how we're not finished with our own sanctification. We can still build each other up in the spirit. The eye sees what's wrong with the hand, and the hand can take the mote out of the eye. And so as Christians particularly, we should be helping one another develop this common sense humility. It's very much a matter of discipleship, and making identity and community something that furthers our pursuit of truth instead of hindering it. Because identity and community are very powerful, and community, or the desire to be in community, the desire to be someone whose identity is valued, can confuse us as much as it can edify us. But our identity is not in a political tribe, in an in-group opposing an out-group, seeking victory for itself and making knowledge a tool of winning, or at least it shouldn't be. We belong to Christ, and so that should mean that we're people of truth, people with a feel for truth. The way you can feel the difference between polyester and cotton. It should be instinctive like that. People who can recognize truth when we encounter it, even when it comes from unexpected sources, which I realize in many cases will mean the press. So on that note, I have 3 discussion questions for you. These are also written down in your packets. So I will turn things over to you guys to talk, and I think Nap will come up when it's time to talk.